Stegahites, chapters 10 through 12. Chapter 10. Emily. Yuck. Driana stood deep in the muck of mire of the entrance cave, looking for torch supplies. She had just picked up a thigh bone of a deer and was reaching for a bit of hide when the glint of gold caught her eye. She used the bone to move away some of the muck and picked up a bit of metal. She had to squint her eyes to see in the dim light to see what it was. Horror struck her as she realized what she held was a tiny gold locket on a delicate chain. Kansora's words, "So I finally found the right one," echoed through her head, making her sick to her stomach as she screamed and ran headlong back to the nest cave. Dree sobbed bitterly into her hands as she sank to the floor next to the nest. How many young girls had died in Kansora's search for her? How many were buried in the muck of that cave? Oh, those poor girls, she sobbed. Oh, their poor families. Dree cried for hours as she thought of the families of the girls Kansora had murdered and of her own Papa Colin and Mama Belle. Oh, what they must be going through, not knowing if she was dead or alive. I have to find a way out of here. I have to find a way home, she sobbed. After a few moments, Dree's head snapped up from her knees as an idea struck her. I can send a message, she breathed. The wolves. There have got to be wolves in these mountains. They can relay a message to the pack near home. Somehow they could let them know I'm alive, she said out loud. Dree stood and began to make her way to the outer entrance when she thought of the girl with the locket. She didn't deserve to die, Dree thought, and she doesn't deserve to be left in that disgusting mess. She deserves a proper burial. After climbing to the outer ledge of the cave, Dree howled out her message and waited. There was no reply. She tried again and again and still got no reply. Disheartened, she steeled herself for what she had to do next. Walking back into the cave, she squared her shoulders and waded into the muck. Finding the locket, she carefully picked up the remains of the girl it belonged to and carried them outside. She dug a grave in a grassy area near the mouth of the cave and buried the bones as gently as she could. Sitting next to the small mound of dirt, Driana looked more closely at the locket, turning it over in her hand. It was small and heart-shaped with something engraved on the front. Taking the hem of her dress, Dree wiped it clean and held it up to the sunlight. The name Emily was inscribed in tiny letters in the center of the heart. Inside, Dree found pictures of a man and woman, her parents, she thought. Dree picked up a stone and scratched, "Rest in peace, Emily," in the cave base above the grave. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Emily, she whispered. Somehow, I'll let your family know what happened to you. I promise. Dree said as she knelt and placed her hand on the grave and cried gentle tears. Images of horror flashed through Driana's mind as she sat there. Images not only of what had happened to Emily, but to all the other girls who had suffered and died because of Kansora's evil. Her tears disappeared and a hot spot began to grow in the pit of her stomach. A feeling she had never felt before began to take over her heart. How could that, that thing do something so evil? How could she be so callous about it? Maybe Papa Colin had been right. Maybe some things are just born evil. Maybe some things just had no soul. Which each, with each thought, the hot spot grew in Driana, began to scream. She screamed at the mountains around her, the echoes screaming back. She screamed words she had never used before, not knowing where she had heard them or what they truly meant. She screamed until she had no voice left and her throat was on fire. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. She hated the mountains. She hated the cave. She hated Kansora. She hated dragons. Getting to her feet, Driana raced into the entrance cave. She picked up whatever was in her way and threw it far from her. Crazed with the feelings of hatred, she stomped on flesh and bone. She threw sticks and stones against the cave wall, laughing hysterically as they smashed into tiny pieces. She growled as she smashed insects and maggots defiantly under her feet. She laughed a horrible evil cackle as the tiny bugs scurried to get away and laughed harder as she stomped down and with a twist of her foot. Without thinking, Driana ran into the nest cave, determined to destroy all that had to do with Kansora, all that had to do with dragons. As she reached the end of the tunnel, her anger swelled, filling her heart. She kicked her food basket aside, sending what remained of her rations sailing against the wall. She snatched up her blanket and sent it flying as well. Grabbing the shovel from against the wall, she raised it above her head like an axe. The edge of the shovel's head glinted in the red light of the nest. Her heart raced as she approached. She wouldn't let evil survive. She just couldn't. As she raised the shovel higher, a large bubble burst in the pool, illuminating the tiny creatures nestled so sweetly inside each egg. Driana's heart skipped a beat, and a sob escaped her throat. She dropped the shovel and sank to her knees. "What am I doing?" she sobbed. "They're babies, innocent babies." Her heart ached as she thought of what she had almost done. Fresh tears filled her eyes as she thought of what she had almost become. "I would have been a monster. One worse than your mother," she whispered to the eggs. "I'm sorry." Dree sat and watched the eggs for a long moment. A thought entered her mind, one that she would never have dreamed of before this day. At that moment, Dree made a decision that would change her life and that of everyone she knew forever. Later that evening, Dree sat next to Emily's grave, staring up at the stars-filled sky. A gentle breeze played with the end of her hair and tickled the tip of her nose. She leaned her head against a cool granite stone with thoughts and plans muddling through her mind. She had to get away. She had to get out of this cave and off this mountain. But how? She banged her head against the stone wall. Think, think, think. Frustrated, she stood and began pacing back and forth in front of the cave entrance. She pounded her forehead with her palm. There had to be a way. There just had to. Her time was growing short. Her rations were getting low, and unless Kansora brought her more food, she would be out in 3 or 4 days. The thought of that creature returning made her stomach turn. She wanted to be gone long before that happened. But how? Another thought entered her mind and made her stomach turn again. If she couldn't find a way out, what would she eat? If the dragon didn't come back, could she bring herself to kill another creature and eat it? Oh, please let me find a way out, she whispered to the wind. A sound far in the distance brought Driana's attention around abruptly. That wolf howl? Several tense seconds later, the sound came again. Yes, it was a wolf, but she couldn't make out what it said, howling a message to come closer. She waited several more minutes before she heard it again. She could just make out a few words. Riders, foothills, soon. Could it be? Was someone coming for her? How long? Oh, please let it be. Would they get there in time? Oh, please. It could be anybody, her rational mind took over. They might not even know about me. Her heart sank at the thought entered her mind. Oh, please, it has to be, her heart cried. She heard the wolf's howl once more, and this time it was loud and clear. The words made her catch her breath and nearly faint. Following hawk was what she heard. Juliana let out a cry of sheer joy. Talon! Talon was leading them to her. There could be no doubt about it. She spun a little dance, tears streaming down her face. Did you hear that, Emily? She said, turning towards the grave. They're coming for me. Oh, please let them get here in time. Chapter 11. Giggle, Giggle, Gotcha. The people of Dahlia Village had been very helpful to Devon and the others during their short stay there. John Grayston and his family had happily agreed to take Marvin home, saying it was the least they could do after the return of their little boy. Although curious of how the boy had been lost in the first place, Devlin never asked. It really didn't matter anyway, now that he was home. Kay was to ride along to keep an eye on Marvin's wounds. Old Man Potts wouldn't have it any other way. Besides, he had young William to help him with everything that needed done. The rest of the villagers were happy to help with provisions and the like, saying they hadn't had so many visitors since a very long time. One old farmer said he had seen two fellows riding north through the old woods, but they didn't answer when he hollered, "Hello!" No one paid much attention to the old man, so it wasn't mentioned again. Everyone gathered along the main street to wave their goodbyes as the boys rode off to the north, following Talon's "Follow me" screams. Tosh remained quiet for many miles, looking over his shoulder often. The worry on his face was plain to see, and Devlin wondered if he was truly strong enough for what lay ahead. Otto remained his boisterous, bullying self, although Devlin sensed a change in him as well. The boys pushed themselves hard, not stopping for nearly 2 days. It seemed that fear drove them on, not the fear of what lay ahead, but more of what was left behind. None could explain how they really felt, only that they had to keep moving. And move they did, through every ever-thickening forest. Devlin felt a tenseness he had never felt before rise and settle in his shoulders. The noises of the forest seemed normal at first, a rustle of leaves or a whistle of wind in the grass. But now something just wasn't right. He knew the others felt the strangeness as well, because each time the noises came, Otto would swing around in the saddle and swear under his breath. Tosh seemed to sink deeper into himself with every little noise. They were deep in the thickest part of the forest when they decided to stop for the night. A thin veil of mist seemed to be trapped under the dark canopy of leaves, making the place look eerie in the twilight hours. The sounds of birds and forest animals echoed through the trees, but it was the other sounds that made goosebumps run down their spines. Devlin and Tosh made quick work of building a fire while Otto tended to the horses with record speed. Neither wandered more than a few feet from the fire, agreeing that it was a real chill night in the air. Even Talon stayed close to the firelight. It wasn't long after supper that strange sounds could be heard in the deep darkness of the forest. At first it sounded a bit like tinkling bells, but no, it was the giggling of little girls. Tosh covered his ears with his hands and whispered harshly, "It's the fairies, come to steal our souls." Otto scoffed and laughed out loud. "That's just a story parents tell to scare their kids into staying out of trouble. Don't tell me you believe it." Devlin stared into the fire and said, "When I was a kid, my father told me about people disappearing into the woods after hearing strange sounds. He said they were lured into the dark by sweet voices from their dreams and were never heard from again." "The fairies," Tosh said with hushed tones, his ever-widening eyes scanning the dark forest. "Oh, come on. You two mama's boys have got to be joking," Otto hooted and slapped his knee. Devlin stood and walked to the horses. He returned a moment later with a square of muslin in his hand. Ripping it into 6 pieces, he handed 2 to Tosh and said, "I, for one, don't want to take any chances. This fire is warm and safe, and is where I intend to stay all night." Tosh looked at him and then at Otto, and after a moment shoved the pieces of cloth in his ears. Wrapping his blanket over his head, he planted his feet and stared straight into the fires, eyes wide without blinking. Devlin smiled and handed 2 pieces to Otto, who waved them away with a scoff. Shrugging, Devlin put them in his pocket and placed the last 2 pieces of muslin in his own ears. Neither boy slept a wink as they huddled in their bedrolls. Devlin lay staring into the fire, trying hard not to worry about his mother, Marvin, the hardships ahead, and most of all about whether or not the girl, Brianna, was still alive. In an instant it seemed the world around them exploded. Silvery lights and loud female laughter came from all sides, sending the horses into a panic, and Talon soaring skyward, screaming as he went. Tosh let out a tiny cry as he crushed his hand over his ears, scrunching his eyes tightly closed, and began to hum loudly. Devlin covered his ears as well and watched in amazement as the lights began to twinkle and shift until they were no longer lights, but dazzlingly beautiful women, each naked, but for a set of silvery wings. The laughter turned into an eerie song that Devlin could only sense, but not really hear. Otto sat up in the midst of all the chaos and was instantly set upon. The women began to tug at his clothes and tease him with soft touches and gentle voices. Otto would reach out to touch, and the girls would flutter just beyond his fingertips. The fairies taunted and teased the boy until he stood and began to follow them farther and farther from the fire's light. Devlin tried to call Otto back, but got no reaction at all. He scampered after him and tried to pull him back, but Otto shoved him hard. Regaining his balance, Devlin tried once more to stop Otto's departure, but stepped directly in front by stepping directly in front of him and shouting at the top of his lungs. This only caused Otto to shove twice as hard, and this time Devlin hit the ground hard, hitting his head on the root of a tree. The last thing he saw was Otto stumbling away as the sight faded into nothingness. A weight on his chest brought Devlin awake with a start. Talon looked at him in the eye and fluttered to a branch a few feet away. Devlin shook his head and stood up. He had no idea how long he had been knocked out, but there was no sign of Otto or the horses anywhere. He stumbled a little as he headed back to the fire and the still huddled, humming Tosh. When Devlin touched his shoulder, Tosh jumped up screaming repeatedly, his eyes still tightly closed. He gave a little laugh and his face turned bright red as he opened his eyes and saw Devlin's face. With an embarrassed smile, Tosh looked away and around the camp. His shy smile turned into instant panic at Otto's absence hit him. "Oh, man, they took 'em, didn't they?" he nearly screamed. "They took 'em! They took 'em! Oh, man, they took 'em!" Tosh's hands went up on his head and he spun around and around. "What we gonna do? What we gonna do now?" he thought as he sank to the ground. Devlin laid his hand on Tosh's shoulder and said calmly, "Let's find the horses and pack up camp. We'll start looking for him. You never know, he might have gotten away." Tosh took a deep breath, nodding, and started rolling up his bedding, all the while muttering, "They got him," under his breath. Windancer and Thunder were back instantly to Devlin's shrill whistle, but Mountain, it seemed, had disappeared right along with Otto. Devlin did his best to remain calm and reassuring as they searched the woods all that day, but by nightfall he had to admit that they truly might have got him. Both boys looked tired and worn as they stopped to set up camp. As Devlin pulled his bedroll from Windancer's saddle, he muttered, "How can anything that big just disappear like that?" Tosh shook his head and answered, "Yeah, that mountain was one big horse." "I wasn't talking about the horse," Devlin says as he shook out his blanket. Tosh let out a grunt and then a giggle, and in no time both boys were laughing so hard they doubled over with tears in their eyes. It was well after dark when footsteps were heard crashing through the woods. Tosh had stood and started to shout when Devlin hushed him harshly and pulled his sword across his lap. Tosh quickly drew a knife from his boot and sat a few feet away. A moment later, a stranger stepped into the light of the fire. Devlin instantly recognized the man and let the blade of his sword glint in the firelight. "Tell your friend to come to the light," was all he said. The stranger started to take a step forward, saying, "Well now," when the sword blade glinted again. Stopping, he whistled and waved to somebody behind him, never taking his eyes off Devlin. Heavy footsteps announced the stranger's companion, a bear of a man with an oafish grin. "My name's Thatcher, Camden Thatcher," the stranger said, "and this here is too big. We saw your fire and thought maybe we could get some coffee and maybe something to eat." "Why are you following us?" Devlin asked without moving a muscle. Thatcher gave a cockeyed smile and said, "You're a good boy. I'll give you that. Can we sit down and warm ourselves, or are you gonna make us stand all night? Devlin nodded toward the fire. Tosh looked a bit antsy but said nothing as the two men moved closer to the fire and sat down. You didn't answer my question, Devlin repeated. Why are you following us? Well, son, Too Big and I, we're what you might call big game hunters of sorts. And back in the inn, we heard your red-headed friend say something about going after a beast. A dragon beast, if I'm not mistaken, Thatcher said with a smug grin. You are mistaken, Devlin started to say. By the way, what happened to your friend anyway? Thatcher asked, cutting Devlin off. Tosh sputtered and stood up. They took him. They got him, he said, and pointed to the trees and sat back down with a thud. Too Big suddenly covered his ears and began to hum loudly. They not get me, they not get me, he said over and over again. Thatcher kicked him hard and shouted, Shut up, you big dummy. There ain't nothing out there. Too Big groaned like a wounded bull and gave Thatcher a look like a scolded child. After a second or two, he settled against a tree and watched the flames with a dull grin. You are mistaken, Devlin started again, waiting a moment to be sure that he had Thatcher's attention. We're not after a dragon, as you claim. You calling me a liar, boy? Thatcher growled, standing up quickly. The sword blade in Devlin's lap glinted once again, causing Thatcher to slowly sit back down. No, sir, I'm not, Devlin said evenly. We're not after a dragon. We are after a girl taken by a dragon. We're going to rescue her and take her home. The look on Thatcher's face changed in an instant. A look of pity crossed his brow and he said, Go home, boys. Just go home before it's too late. That is not going to happen, Devlin said with determination. This girl is special. Thatcher stood up slowly and shook his head. They all are, he sighed. They all are. Turning back toward the woods and kicking Too Big, he walked off into the darkness. Chapter 12. Dolan hums. Thwack! Splinters flew in all directions. Thwack! Another log exploded into pieces. With each blow of the axe, Collins saw Cansora's beastly head roll across the barnyard. With each blow, his pain and sorrow released. It had been so long with no word. So many questions and oh, so many tears. Was she still alive? Could she be? She was. She had to be. Collins squared his shoulders and swung the axe again. Collins' thoughts were miles away when the bell in the town square rang. The axe had hit the ground and he was running before he fully realized that Belle was beside him. He took her hand and they picked up speed, running for what they both hoped for with all their hearts. They met the Oleys, Catches, and the Widow Thomas on the way, and together they headed into the village. By the time they reached the town square, a crowd had gathered around a large covered wagon parked in front of the livery. Peggy Cash wasted no time in pushing her way through, only to stop dead in her tracks when she saw the horse tied to the back of the wagon. She turned and blocked the Oleys' way with a look of anguish on her face. The look made tears spring to Catherine Oley's eyes, but she squared her shoulders and pushed past the larger woman, with the rest of them right behind her. As they reached the front of the wagon, a large man was helping a woman from the wagon seat. "Hello, folks," My name is John Grayston. This is my wife, Cassie, and my son, David, he said as he reached for a small boy. We brought one of your boys home. He handed the boy to his mother and turned towards him. Belle's heart caught in her throat as the man turned and shook hands with Amos Oakley. She looked up at her husband and realized he saw it too. But the thought quickly vanished as the Oakleys were led to the back of the wagon. The crowd followed the couple with a collective gasp went out as a young woman opened the canvas flap. Don't worry, Mrs. Oakley, he's fine. A bit of a crybaby, but just fine. Oh, ha, ha, could be heard from the back of the wagon. And as Mr. Grayston and Amos opened the back gate, Marvin Oakley could be seen laying on a bed of blankets with a silly grin on his face. Marvin's mother broke into tears. His father didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did both. And their son was loaded onto a wagon to be taken home. Miss Cora led the Graystons and the other families to her inn so that they may talk a bit in privacy, she said. John told them what had happened, and that when they had seen the boys last, they were all doing fine. He smiled down at the widow Thomas and said, "That boy of yours is strong, ma'am. They all are. They'll do what they set out to do. I know they will." "Of course they will," Cash piped up. "My boy can do anything he puts his mind to." The pride she felt for her son radiated from her smile. "Mrs. Thomas, your son told us about your farm and his worry for you. If you would allow my wife and I to camp on your property, I would be more than happy to work your farm until he returns," John said as Cassie stood to stand beside him. "He gave us back our family. At least we can do is take care of his," she said in a small voice and smiled sweetly as the boy played on the floor. "He gave us back more than that, my love. He gave us back our life," John said as he took his wife's hand. "You see, our boy David got lost in the woods some time back. We searched for weeks but couldn't find him. I lost someone dear to me years ago, so losing David nearly killed me. I was pretty close to losing my mind over it when your son brought him back to us. I mean all your boys. They really are a fine group of men." Mrs. Thomas could only nod her agreement as tears misted her eyes. Pride mixed with fear and loneliness she felt. Her son was strong, like his father, and as brave. She knew then that he would come home. There was no more doubt. As the Beckwiths and the Cashes left the inn a short time later, there was a new sense of peace in all of them. Marvin had been hurt, but would survive, and the others were still moving toward the mountains and Vienna. There was hope. The end of this reading.